Okay, hello, this is Christian speaking from NEPCON again. We are ready here to start the third and final of our webinars in the series on the new FSC control book standard, the version 3 of the standard. And in this webinar we are going to look a little closer on risk mitigation and the methods that can be used by organizations in working with suppliers to mitigate risks. I'm going to look a little bit more on some examples where I will talk about risk mitigation in a more practical ways. A little bit about NEPCON. We are a not-for-profit organization that works to ensure responsible use of natural resources and secure sustainable livelihoods by transforming land use, business practices and consumer behavior. And one of the tools that we use to obtain this goal is to use certification systems such as FSC. NEPCON has more than 20 years experience in working with verification and certification of legal and sustainable forest management practices through FSC, but also through PEFC, the Sustainable Biomass Partnership, and our own legal source program and other certification schemes. We were the first organization or certification body to be accredited by ASI and FSC to conduct certification against version 3 of the control book standard. And we are also recognized as an EUTR monitoring organization, which happened back in August 2013. The agenda for today is that I'm going to look a little bit on the general due diligence process and risk assessment steps in the control book standard, which I also touched on in the other webinars, but just to recap some of the important issues. I'm going to look at the risk mitigation process in the control book system, and then I'm going to look more closely at some examples of working with suppliers in risk mitigation and make more practical discussion on how risk mitigation works and what practical steps companies can take in different situations. When we look at the whole due diligence process that's being implemented in the new control book standard, it's important to understand that it's a iterative process, meaning that the different steps in the due diligence process can be repeated for the same sources depending on the issues that are being addressed. So the whole process in the control book system is to collect information and access information about the source area where material is originating from, and then identify which risks are relevant for that area using the risk assessments that are available from FSC, or conducting risk assessments if there are no FSC approved risk assessments available. Also in evaluating the supply area in terms of source types. That's important, of course, if the source type has influence on the type of risk or the level of risks that are applicable in the sourcing or in the supply chain. An example could be the difference between sourcing plantation timber, between sourcing timber from natural forest, where the risk may differ significantly. Then when risks has been identified and specified for the source area, a risk mitigation strategy should be developed to outline the different steps in the risk mitigation process to ensure that each of the risks that are specified for the source area are actually being addressed. Then the control measures that have been identified in the strategy should be established and implemented, and we will look at some examples later on what those can be. And then going forward in the process, there needs to be a continuous monitoring of the implementation of control measures to verify that the control measures are in fact efficient in mitigating the risks that have been identified. In the controllable standard, it's required that risks are being assessed both at the level of the forest, a source area, so the risks of violating the 5 controllable categories are being evaluated at forest level, but the standard also requires organizations to evaluate the risk of mixing in the supply chain. So these are the 2 main areas of focus for the risk assessment, and also the areas where risk mitigation will then have to be conducted. A very important point when we are talking about the controllable system is to understand which risk assessment to use, and obviously FSC has conducted a large number of risk assessments over the years and are currently working on revising those. There will be they're currently in the process of publishing and approving a large number of risk assessments against the new version of the FSC procedure for risk assessments. So in the process of looking at the source areas, you will have to identify which risk assessment is available, if there is any, and you can use this website here, the FSC website, where all approved FSC risk assessments will be published, and also information on each country, at what stage the different risk assessments are. A very important point here is that there is a hierarchy in the FSC system of different risk assessments. At the top, the one that the aim is that everybody uses if the country in question is covered by the program, is the national risk assessment developed by the national FSC initiative in the country of origin according to procedure 60002 version 3. So this is the highest level of the risk assessment. The next level here is what is called the centralized national risk assessment, which is a similar risk assessment but just coordinated by FSC itself and developed according to the same procedure as the above, but developed not by the national initiative. Then we have as number 3, the existing national risk assessments developed against FSC procedure 60002 version 2. That's the old style risk assessment. So they can be used if there is no risk assessment developed according to version 3 of the procedures. Currently, it says here should not be used after the 31st of December 2017, but it looks like that will be changed from a recent communication from the FSC board that the old version of the risk assessments will be able to be used until the national or centralized national risk assessments against the new procedure has been approved. So that will probably be an extension of this timeline for when the old version of the risk assessments can be used. Similarly, it's possible to conduct what is called a simplified risk assessment or an extended risk assessment by the company themselves if there are no risk assessment for the area of sourcing. So this is the framework of the risk assessments from FSC and which shall be used for all the risk assessment. In these risk assessments there are also suggestions for risk mitigation measures which needs to be used if they're there. It's mainly the newer version of the risk assessment that contain clear risk mitigation measures or control measures for risks. So when we look at the risk of mixing, the second leg of the risk assessment process, there's a number of indicators that can be used for that, even though FSC have not published any formally approved risk assessments on a country level. It will more be an assessment of different indicators in the supply chain by the certified organization themselves, looking at, for example, the supply chain complexity. So how many different sources are involved in the supply chain, many different species, the transparency of supply chain, obviously the availability of information about origin, about supply chain participants and forests of origin, and also the quality of information or documentation are important indicators of risks in the supply chain. Something like the species could also be a good indication of legality or the risk of mixing, sorry. It's clear that certain species are more subject to illegal or fraudulent practices in the supply chain being mixed with different types of origin. But the key is that the risk that uncontrolled material is mixed into the supply chain is assessed. Also says here that the risks within entities that material is mixed has to be evaluated. For example, depending on the complexity of the product, are there many different inputs to a product, and also the existence of tracking or traceability systems should be evaluated. So whenever risks is specified, whether being at origin or related to mixing, the organization has to implement requirements of Section 4 of the Control Board Standard, which relates to mitigation actions. And any risk mitigation has to be conducted prior to the material being used as controlled material or sold as FSC control wood. That means that you cannot source material and then sell it on and then do a backtracking and backdate your risk assessment. The risk assessment and risk control of any risks has to be conducted prior to sourcing the material or using it as FSC control. A fundamental step in the risk assessment or risk mitigation process is really to take a step back once the risk has been identified. It is really a business decision at this point to decide, do we go ahead with the same supply chain and try to control risks, or can we actually do something completely different to avoid the risk altogether? So that's what this illustration means to show, is that you kind of have a choice here to say, well, we know that this supply chain contains certain risks. We can then either say, well, we are not going to do anything, so we will avoid the risk by replacing the supplier or buying some different species, different types of material that has confirmed that meets the control with low risk requirements, or we can source already FSC certified material. If that specific supply chain cannot be avoided, that means that the risk cannot be avoided by choosing something else, then the process has to be conducted to go ahead and further specify what the exact risks are, and then implement control measures to control that the specified risks. And that can be done either by, it can be done different ways, again depending on what types of risks are relevant, but it can be done by working closely with suppliers and agree that they actually take an active role in implementing risk mitigation further upstream in the supply chain. Also, for certain risks, it may be possible just to collect additional information which is supplied by suppliers about the supply chain, about the forest operation. So that can be lab testing, a documentation of conformance to the control wood categories, and so on. Another activity here is to carry out on-site supplier forest verification audits to actually verify, here it says legal compliance, but not only legal compliance, but conformance to the 5 control wood categories. When looking at the risk mitigation strategy, it's important to look at the different factors that influence the risk. And of course, the nature of the risk is really important when making a strategy, because just at the source of the material, the risk may be related to the violation of local communities' rights to forest. It's obvious that the risk mitigation activities for a risk like that will be very different from if there's a specified risk that the forest does not have a approved forest management plan. So the nature of the risk mitigation or the control measures really depends on what type of risk we are talking about and where in the supply chain the risk is located. Also, it has to be considered whether or not it's likely that the risk mitigation can actually be efficient or be successful. It may be that it's not possible to go through with the required actions, and therefore a third option has to be developed. Obviously, also cost is an important issue here, and an important business decision for companies to look at. Is it really cost efficient for us to go through with these mitigation measures, or do we have to look for other options? Technical capacity and human resources before going into, for example, conducting on-site verification of processing or forest level suppliers. You of course have to make sure that you have the capacity to do so. Otherwise, and if you don't, you will have to look elsewhere to hire experts that can help you. Also, the relationship with suppliers is important, and we'll get back to that. Level of control of suppliers. Of course, you have to be able to collaborate with suppliers in order for them to agree to support you, provide the relevant information, provide documents, provide access to their sources of material if you have a longer supply chain. So, and similar in this strategy, you will have to prioritize and optimize risk mitigation supplies according to different source types. It may be that certain source types are more important for your business than others. It also may be that certain source types are more difficult to mitigate risk for than others. Therefore, it makes sense to group different suppliers or source types when you are developing the risk mitigation strategy. So back to this process, in looking at the actual risk assessment and control process in practice, when you identify your source areas, you evaluate risk at forest level, a risk of mixing, then go in and classify source types. And if you identify that you cannot mitigate risk, you have to go back and identify new source areas or specify the risks further to conduct efficient risk mitigation. You can also go ahead and develop the risk mitigation strategy, and again, if that strategy shows that it's not really efficient or possible to mitigate, again, you have to go back and identify new source areas and conduct the same process again. So this whole process can be iterative at different stages in the process. When we then get to the role of suppliers, it's really important to understand that often it will not be possible to efficiently mitigate risks if they're specified at forest level or even in the supply chain without the collaboration of suppliers. The suppliers will often be closer to the area of the sourcing and where the risks are. They will have local knowledge, they will speak the local language, and will be able and can play and should play a key role in supporting the risk mitigation activities. So if you're working with a forest, for example, you're sourcing logs from that forest, it's obvious that if there are risks in that forest, that they violate certain of the control wood categories, they are the ones that can actually change their actual practices in order for you to verify that none of the control wood categories are being violated. This is a little bit the same as repetition, I'm sorry for that. So what the exact role of suppliers, of course, may also differ in depending on what type of supplier it is, if it's a forest supplier or if it's a processing entity further downstream in the supply chain. But it's obvious from the work that we do with companies that source material and they are implementing due diligence that, you know, without very close collaboration with suppliers, it's very, very difficult to conduct this type of due diligence, because suppliers can provide access to information about the material. They can provide documents that indicate conformance to requirements, like evidence of origins, evidence of the harvest area, that can indicate conformance with the control wood requirements. They can also be used to support implementation of actual control measures, like timber tracking systems, or, as I said before, if it's a forest manager you source from, they are the ones that can actually revise their practices to mitigate any risks of violating the control wood categories. So they are crucial in this, and if they do not collaborate, then it will not be possible. Also, in terms of verification of risks or monitoring of the risk mitigation measures, suppliers can obviously play a key role. One activity that we are also implementing and see implemented is that companies can conduct what we call supplier verification, and that's basically auditing of suppliers to verify legal conformance or conformance against the control wood requirements. They can also be verification of timber tracking systems, and in general to verify the effectiveness of risk mitigation actions. So for the not only can the verifiers, not only can the suppliers play a role in providing access to documentation and play a role in mitigating risks, but they also have to subject themselves to being evaluated, both of the company sourcing material, who is verifying the efficiency of control measures, but also by the CB that is auditing the requirements, where verification audits or sample audits will also be required. So that's what I said here. The objectives of the verifications audits can be to verify compliance of systems of suppliers, so that looks at the efficiency of risk mitigation, and then also verify the effectiveness of risk mitigation. So this is kind of the overall approach to looking at using suppliers to play an active role, or the role that they will have to take in controlling risks in supply chain. I'm going to look at some examples here. There'll be different types of examples, both for mixing but also risks at forest level. So try to look a little bit on some specific risks examples and what mitigation actions and verification activities would be relevant. So the first here is a very generic example where it's just some examples of supplier verification in relation to risk related to legality. So we have risks here of legal violation of customary rights at forest level. So this would both be relevant to legality but also to control wood category 2. So if the risk assessment in question have identified that there are risks at forest level, that customary rights are being violated at forest level, then mitigation actions would be first to verify that the presence of any issues related to this at the source area, and then manage any legal non-compliances by ensuring management practices includes respect of customary rights. So this is an example where the forest level would have to play a very active role in changing practices, and then subsequently audits and stakeholder consultations and interviews would have to be able to document that these customary rights are actually being honored by the forest management. So if your supplier is a forest in this case, these risks are being verified to be there, that maybe they're harvesting in indigenous peoples or customary rights areas, the forest of course have to change those practices, stop harvesting within those areas, and then verification audits have to document that those practices are in fact not happening anymore. So this is an example where on-site verification and stakeholder consultation would be required. The second here is also from the category 1 legality, and that's related to risk of violation of custom regulations. So again, before mitigation actions are being implemented, of course it should be verified if there is actually a violation in the specific supply chain. The fact that an issue has been identified as specified risk in a national risk assessment, of course, does not mean that every supply chain in fact has this legal or this violation of the control board requirements. So it's also a matter of verifying, well, let's say that this risk of violation of custom regulations, of course, if you can prove that the custom regulations are being adhered to, then there is no need to conduct risk mitigation. But if there are certain issues that custom documents, for example, are not being issued correctly, or there's been fraud with custom documents, then of course the procedures and the implementations of those by the supplier has to be revised in order to meet the specific custom requirements. And then subsequently going forward and on an ongoing basis, you would have to verify that the custom documents continue to be issued in accordance with the regulations. The last one here is also from category 1, risk of violation of harvest regulations related to environmental requirements. Again, it's the same system. Let's say that there are certain requirements related to harvesting within buffer zones in a forest. Then if the forest management enterprise would have systems in place to avoid this, and they could provide documentation that they are being audited, for example, that could be evidence to that the risk has been mitigated. Otherwise, the forest manager or harvest contractor would have to change harvest practices to meet these legal requirements. And then again, this would also require forest level verification to verify that the change in practices by the forest manager has actually been implemented. So these were a few very generic examples. Here's an example related to mixing in the supply chain of uncontrolled material. This is an example from furniture produced in China from Mongolian oak, where information were provided by the company with this type of supply chain, where you would have an unknown forest level or unknown forest in northeast China, and a factory in Shanghai, and then an importer or a retailer in the UK buying these types of furniture. Obviously, the risk assessment of this was that it was a non-negligible risk because there is it's well known that Mongolian oak is a valuable and high risk species that is often being mixed with oak from Russia. And there's a high level of corruption in that part. There's a lot of evidence that these supply chains are being mixed and substituted with illegal material from Russia. So what does the company then do to mitigate these risks? And this is actually what we did in reality. First of all, the sourcing of these types of material were stopped, and then the origin of the material were verified using a laboratory called Agro-Isolab to use isotope testing to verify the origin. And this test in this case was actually verified to be China. So the material did not come from Russia. It did actually come from China. And that then enabled us to say, well, okay, then at least the risk of mixing with illegal material from Russia has been mitigated, but we would like additional information and documentation about the origin to verify the legal origin of that material. And then the ongoing actions would be to continue a lab testing program and check documents very carefully to verify that material from Russia is not mixed into the product, and also the supplier in question here has actually committed to change their sourcing of oak from using Chinese source material to use oak sourced from North America and European oak, and put a chain of custody system in place, and also to submit at factory level to third-party auditing to verify that the chain of custody system is being put in place. So in this case, there was actually a very good collaboration with the supplier. They agreed to change their sourcing to accommodate the requirement from the buyer in Europe. They put in place a chain of custody system, and they also agreed to be audited. So in this case, in fact, they changed their whole supply chain to source European or North American oak instead of high-risk material from China. So this is, I think, a very good example of a successful risk mitigation and also successful collaboration with a supplier, where they have actually changed completely the way that they are doing business. The next example here is more related to forest level risk. Here it's a theoretical example, but one I think that's very realistic for the situation that we often see in Russia. So this is a Russian sawmill that sources logs from the western region of Russia. They have 15 suppliers, of which 9 are concession holders, and the other 6 are traders around wood. So that means that here we have a relatively short and simple supply chains. So 9 are directly going to the forest, and the others, there's only one tier between the forest and the sawmill. That's the trader in this case. So obviously here also the traders and the forest managers will have to be engaged in the risk mitigation process. But the first step, of course, as we talked about earlier, is to identify what the risk assessment that has to be used is. And then I looked up on the FSC website here, and this is the information you get when you press Russia, and we can see that there's an approved risk assessment against the old version. There's a national risk assessment that was finalized in July 2015 against version 2, but there's also 2 categories of the CNRA that has been finalized for categories 2 and category 5. And there's also some new evidence, and I mentioned that before, that actually where national risk assessment process is taking place, companies can use part of the assessment of when only some but not all categories of the national risk assessment have been concluded. So that means in this case they could use the whole version 2.1 here, but they're also allowed to use the new risk assessment that's being published here. But if we look a little bit closer to what this organization is doing, they have implemented a approval program for suppliers, and they implement that prior to approving any wood or sourcing any wood from the suppliers. So what they will do is that they will control legally required registration and documents. They will visit suppliers' office, including interviews, review of procedures, and review of their records of production and trade. They will also conduct stakeholder consultation and always include the local forest authorities and local administration to evaluate any potential risks of ongoing investigations, for example, or other violations that have come to the attention of the authorities. They are also implementing a system for field verification to the harvest sites, and they have created a binding commitment from suppliers to follow all requirements of the FSC control standard. So of course the last point here is it's a little bit of a paper exercise, but it's always a good idea to have this kind of more formal agreement with suppliers that commit them to actually abide for the rules that has been set in an agreement. We often recommend that companies include these kind of commitments as part of a purchasing contract, where the supplier will actually commit to follow specific requirements as part of a sales contract. So this company have then approved 3 new suppliers. They have terminated 1 contract because they didn't comply with the sourcing requirements. Also 2 suppliers have obtained FSC certification, so they were therefore excluded from the verification program. So all suppliers have had office visits during sourcing requirements, evaluated the harvest plans for the next year. Sorry. And the organization purchased have visited most of the ongoing operation sites, and they have conducted field verification of each supplier for 1 of 2 of the logging sites. So it's kind of a sampling systems. And here were some observations that were related to the risk. That means that this is part of an ongoing monitoring of the harvesting operations, where there's been observation of harvesting taking place outside the approved area, and in another at other logging sites the protection equipment was not in place or used by the loggers. So that means that in this case there are some evidence of violations of the legal requirements for harvesting, which then has to be followed up by the forest manager. This is an overview of or a summary of the due diligence system for this company. We can see that there are for the risk of mixing. So these are the risks, the mixing risks here evaluated by the company. So we can see for wood delivered directly from concession holder, or wood delivered direct to organization's log yard, or wood delivered and purchased directly from concession holder, the risk of mixing is considered low because it's so direct purchase. However, for wood delivered from forest to railway terminal and transported by train to the organization, the risk is identified that it could be mixed with other sources, because there's like terminals where there could be mixing of other material. So the control measures that are described here is that there is a contract with the supplier to keep material segregated from other material. There's a verification that the suppliers have procedures in place not to mix. So they have the agreement, and then they have procedures, and then there are actually audits of suppliers that check that the procedures are being implemented. And the verification cycle, or the frequency here, is, well, first of all, prior to first purchase of material, the control measures here have been implemented, and then there will be an audit at the terminals at least every 3 years to verify that the same procedures are still being implemented. And here then a summary of the results of verification conducted by the company. So this is just like a summary of what have been verified. So it just shows the findings of the verification of these terminals. Then when we look at the risk at source level, so this means the sourcing at forest level, here are examples from category 1, illegally harvested wood. We have here the number 1 here is the risk that land tenure and management rights. The risk is that the operation does not have legal right to harvest. The control measure here is that prior to approving the supplier, legal registration needs to be verified, and the validity of the lease contract, record of legal violation are being checked. Also, the control of records of legal violations with local authorities, and that's being done the first part prior to first purchase, and when the lease contract expire, and the control of records of legal violation are being conducted annually. The second one here, 1.3, management and harvest planning. The risk is that the operation does not have valid management plan. And then of course the control measure is to check the presence of a valid management plan prior to approval of the supplier, and also that annual harvesting plans are checked at meeting with supplier, and that again is being done prior to the first purchase, and when the lease contract expires, and harvest plans are being verified annually. The third one here, 1.4, harvesting permits, where the risk is that the supplier does not have a valid forest declaration of harvesting permit, or that the forest declaration has been issued for sanitary cutting using bribery. This is something that's quite common in Russia. Then the control measure here is that to request the forest declaration and check the validity prior to the contract and purchase, and the same prior to any purchase, that the organization does not accept any wood that is said to originate from sanitary cutting. So this last one here is actually a way of avoiding risk, because there's a lot of fraud going on with these sanitary cuttings in Russia. So just by avoiding that type of source can be used to mitigate the risk. 1.8 here, the last one, timber harvesting regulations. So the risk is that there is violation of timber harvesting regulations, including requirements to have and comply with the technological logging map for a felling area. So the control measures here is that there is a contract with supplier to check the presence of this logging map, as well as do a desk verification of a sample of documents, and that would happen prior to approval of the supplier into the control wood system, and also as a desk verification at least every 3 years of each supplier. So this is kind of examples of how different types of risks at the source level is being controlled with different types of control measures and how they are being verified. And again, without close collaboration with the suppliers, and in this case the supplier is the forest, it is not possible to conduct things like this. I mean, it's really necessary that there is access to the forest, there's access to all documents, and that they collaborate in all ways to enable this level of verification at the forest level. So this was some examples of some very specific situations that are likely in Russia, and these types of risks are relatively common in the new versions of the risk assessments. So it's something that I expect will be a common occurrence in many of the sourcing of control wood, especially from countries that have the relatively high level of non-conformances. That was all for now. I know that I have gone a little over time, but I hope we can still have time for the questions. Last year I would like to highlight that we are publishing these webinars on our website at this web address. It's the same web address where we posted the notifications for the webinars. So if you want to go and listen to them again, then this is where you can find it. So now I would like to invite any questions. So if you have any questions to this part of the webinar series and to the control wood standard, please go ahead. I will wait here. See if there's a question here. It says, what does this mean? The organization can choose to develop its own due diligence or apply a due diligence system developed by an external party. And this is from the standard. I can see the certification body that evaluates the conformity of the organization with the standard is not eligible to develop the DDS. Okay, so this is a question related directly to the standard requirement, that it just means that the organization under evaluation can develop their own due diligence system, but they could also hire a third or a second party to develop it for them. However, it cannot be the certification body that certifies the organization against the FSC control wood standard that also develops a due diligence system for them. So it's simply a matter of avoiding conflict of interest. It also just means that there is no restrictions on what type of due diligence system any organization can use and who develops it. They are free to develop them as long as, of course, that system fulfills the requirements of the standard. It is conducted with NEPCON program. I'm not sure I understand that question. That's from Robert Makowski asking, it is conducted with NEPCON program? I don't understand that. So if you can just clarify that question. And then there's a question, when can we expect any clarification from FSC International whether old NRA validity period will be extended? Well, I'm not sure when there will be further clarification, but FSC posted a news update, I think it was on the 28th of November, where they informed that the board had decided that the old NRA would be, that organization would be able to use the old NRA not only until the end of 2017, but until there is a new approved CNRA according to the new version of the procedures. So I guess that's a formal already. So I don't expect that there, but it will require that the standard is revised, because that's what they very clearly say in the standard. But that decision has already been made by the FSC board, so I assume that means that it's final and formal. I don't know if there are any more questions. I don't know, does this mean that it is all very simple, or the opposite? All right. If there are no more questions, then I will say thank you for participating. And again, you can go to our website, see this webinar and the other 2 webinars that were conducted in the past week. And of course, you're always welcome to submit any questions or inquiries to the email here. I will close down now, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.